Chapter I Education of the Russian Empire. 1. Russian state at the end of the X7th century. Russia on the eve of reforms. By the end of the X7th century, Russia possessed the largest territory in the world. In the conditions of feudal and serf oppression within the country and a heavy struggle with external enemies, our ancestors formed their independent culture. However, by the end of the X7th century, Russia's backwardness became more and more clear in comparison with the most advanced European countries that had embarked on the path of capitalist development. This was due, mainly, to the extremely unfavorable foreign policy conditions in which the country's development took place. Russia was often attacked by foreigners, robbed and ruined the country. One of the reasons for the backwardness of the country was the Tatar-Mongol yoke, which lasted more than 240 years. For many centuries the Russian state was cut off from the exits to the seas washing the shores of Eastern Europe, in the south dominated by the Tatars and Turks, in the Baltic, Germans and Swedes. The intervention of Poland and Sweden, 1604-1618, also had a decisive influence on the development of the country. The defense of the country was not sufficiently secured. A significant part of the Russian troops still constituted a nobleman's militia, which did not undergo systematic military training. Sagittarians, who lived with families in special settlements, combined military duties with peaceful pursuits, trade and did not have good military training. The best were the regiments of the new formations, soldiers, dragoons, Ratars, but they were not yet quite a regular army. Each regiment commander trained his soldiers as best he could. Among the officers of these regiments there were many foreigners. Therefore, despite the courage inherent in Russian troops, military victories were given at the cost of heavy losses. The 30 Years' War in Germany and the wars of Louis XIV exerted a great influence on the development of European military equipment, artillery, military engineering, the organization and training of troops and their use in combat. The Russian army remained aloof from these achievements. Despite some internal changes, the state structure of Russia has been preserved in the form in which it emerged as far back as the 16th century. The orderly board headed by the Boyar Duma was very slow. The governors in the cities ravaged the population. In the financial system of the state there was a big mess. Tax arrears increased every year, schools were still small, so there was a great shortage of literate and educated people. The backwardness in the field of industry and public administration was a great danger. Although in Russia in the X7th century already appeared advanced for the time large industrial enterprises, manufactories, but much had to be brought from abroad, which made it very difficult to supply the army during the war. The backwardness of Russia was used by neighboring European powers, who sought to seize Russian lands. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich tried to strengthen the western borders of Russia and break the blockade in the Baltic states. But he could not complete his plans. The reforms of the state apparatus undertaken with him were not complete either. After the death of Tsar Alexis, self-interested litigation and disputes between the boyars and nobles for power, for land and for the peasants were further intensified. Especially the stubborn struggle for the throne was between the Miloslavskis and Narishkin boyars. Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich was married twice. His first wife came from the Miloslavsky clan. This marriage left several daughters, including the eldest daughter of Sophia, and the sons of Fyodor and Ivan. The second time Tsar Alexei married shortly before his death at the daughter of a nobleman Narishkin, Natalia Kirillovna. She was brought up in the house of Boyar Artaman Matveyev, close to the Tsar, a supporter of rapprochement with Western culture. In his house Matveyev started the European situation and even held a small troupe of actors. In 1672 the son of Peter was born to Queen Natalia. After the death of Alexei Mikhailovich, his eldest 14-year-old son Fyodor became king, 1676-1682. He was a sickly and weak-willed young man. At the reign of Fyodor Narishkins, nominated in the last years of Alexei Mikhailovich's life due to kinship with the queen, were removed from power. Their place was taken by the Miloslavskis, the Tsar's relatives. Around the king there was a small circle of boyars and nobles close to him who understood the need for transformations in the internal structure of the state. In Moscow, a commission was assembled from elective nobles to improve the organization of the army on the basis of military experience. In 1682, the localism was abolished at the solemn meeting of the Great Cathedral, consisting of the highest clergy and boyars. Near the palace was laid out a fire and burned books, which recorded the local disputes. The military commission improved the organization of the noble army, somewhat bringing it closer to the arrangement of regular regiments. At the court of Fyodor Alexeyevich, a new cultural trend has intensified. In 1687, the Slavic Greek Latin Academy was opened in Moscow. Thus, important changes were made in the struggle against the backwardness of the Russian state. 2. The Board of Sofia. The uprising in Moscow in 1682, Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich died in the spring of 1682, leaving no sons. Therefore, after his death, the Tsarist power was to pass to one of the brothers, to the elder, but to the feeble-minded Ivan or to the younger Peter. Approached by the Tsar, Fyodor boyars were afraid of the seizure of power by the Miloslavskis, and even during the Tsar's life they approached the Narishkins. As soon as Tsar Fyodor died, the Patriarch and boyars proclaimed Peter king. The crowd that gathered at the palace greeted this decision with shouts. The numerous Miloslavskis family did not want to reconcile with the transfer of power to Narishkin. To combat their opponents, the Miloslavskis took advantage of the riots among the Streltsy. The situation of ordinary Streltsy, who were engaged in craft and small trade, at this time deteriorated noticeably due to heavy taxes and general impoverishment of the small townspeople population. Sagittarians did not receive salaries for a long time. Streltsy chiefs from the nobility oppressed the Streltsy and forced them to work in their economy, as serfs. Streltsy, complaining of harassment, were subjected to severe punishments. Proponents of Miloslavsky inspired the archers that the perpetrators of their difficult situation were the Narishkins. On May 15, 1682, the Streltsy captured several cannons and broke loose with banners and drummed into the Kremlin. Crowds shouted in the crowd that the Narishkins had strangled Tsarevich Ivan. Then the mother of Peter, the Queen Natalia Narishkina, brought both brothers, Ivan and Peter, to the porch. But the Streltsy, embittered by oppression and incited against the Narishkins, broke into the palace. One of the first to fall at the hands of the rebellious Streltsy, their chief Prince Dolgoruki. The beating of the boyars lasted until late in the evening. The corpses of the dead were dragged to the execution place under mocking cries. "Here is Boyar Ramadanovsky! Here Dumnikos, give way!" Among the dead were boyars Artem and Matveyev, two elder brothers of the queen, and others. The performance of the Streltsy was accompanied by a broad popular movement. The poor defeated the Kalapi order. Almost all of the enslaving documents stored in it were destroyed. Orders were emptied. The boyars and the deacons fled. Narishkins were forced to give up their place Miloslavsky. The Prince Sophia took advantage of the turmoil to seize power. She fulfilled all the requirements of the archers, paid them detained money for 35 years. At the request of the Streltsy, both brothers, Ivan and Peter, were declared kings, but Ivan, the feeble-minded, became the first king. Sophia herself was declared a ruler with young brothers. The Princess Sophia. The Moscow princesses led a solitary life in the palace tiers. They were little educated and never showed themselves at the people. Sophia stood out sharply among the rest of the princes. Under the guidance of Simeon of Polotsk, she studied Polish and read Polish books. She openly began to appear in society even in the presence of foreigners. The closest person to Sophia, her first minister, was Prince Vasily Vasilyevich Golitsyn. He was one of the most educated boyars of the late 17th century, and was well aware of the need for radical transformation in the country. In conversations with foreigners, Prince Golitsyn told about the planned reforms. But none of the reforms was implemented. During her rule, Sophia was absorbed in the struggle for personal power. She was afraid that the reforms would cause discontent on the part of the influential, conservative boyars. This was also feared by Golitsyn, who had many detractors among the boyars. For a long time, the Polish gentry could not reconcile with the loss of the left careful part of Ukraine and especially of Kiev. After the Androssov Truce in 1667, the Moscow and Polish ambassadors gathered several times to conclude a final peace, but each time the dispute over Kiev led to a break in the negotiations. Meanwhile, the Turkish question forced Poland to make concessions and an agreement with Russia. At this time, Austria, which fought with Turkey, concluded an alliance with Poland and Venice against it. The Allies defeated the Turkish army near Vienna and forced the Sultan to lift the siege from the Austrian capital. But they could not finally defeat the Turks, and therefore they turned to Russia for help. In 1686, the Polish king sent a great embassy to Moscow, which after long negotiations concluded eternal peace. Poland agreed to the annexation of Kiev to Russia with a small territory adjacent to it, and Russia pledged to immediately begin a war with the Crimean Khan, the vassal of the Turkish Sultan. In this war, Russia was interested, since Turkey blocked it on the Black Sea, and the Crimean Tatars continued to attack the southern Russian lands. The first campaign of the Russian army to the Crimea in 1687 under the command of Prince V. Golitsyn ended in complete failure. The troops could not cross the southern steppe, set on fire by the Tatars, had to return back. In the early spring of 1689, an even stronger army, with Prince V. Golitsyn at the head, again moved to the Crimea. This time the troops overcame the difficulties of the steppe campaign and reached the Tatar fortress Perekop, built on the narrowest point of the isthmus. But Golitsyn did not dare to storm Perekop. After a short siege, he gave the order to retreat. The Tatars pursued Russian troops. The failures of the Crimean campaigns strongly shook the position of the government of Sofia. The nobility openly murmured against the difficulties of war and aimless losses. The number of supporters of Peter increased. Youth of Peter. During the reign of Sophia, Peter lived with his mother and close people in the palaces near Moscow, mainly in the village of Preobrazhensky. Peter, although still called the king, actually had no power. In the shady groves surrounding the village of Preobrazhensko, Peter spent whole days playing war with his peers. They built small fortifications from the ground and learned to take them by storm. A few years later, from these amusing soldiers, Peter formed the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky amusing regiments, named after the name of two palace villages. Once Peter found in the villages Palovo among the old things of his grandfather brought from abroad a resident of the German settlement, Brunt, who once served in the navy, learned Peter to sail on this sailing boat first on the narrow Yaoza River, near Moscow, and then on the Izmpailovsky Pond. But the small pond did not allow maneuvering on sails, and Peter asked his mother for permission to swim on the big Peryaslav Lake. Sophia at first rejoiced at the military amusements of Peter, distracting him from the palace affairs. But years passed, Peter grew up, and his amusing grew up. Peter was already the 17th year. 2 regiments, formed for the children's games of Peter, turned into the best Moscow regiments, trained in the European military system. Sophia was aware of the imminent danger and was preparing for a palace coup. She began to officially call herself autocrat. In her palace she secretly accepted and treated the archers, because she wanted to get their support again. The relationship between Sophia and Peter was so hostile that the gap became inevitable. In August 1689, Peter the Knight received news that the princess had collected the Streltsy and was preparing an attack. Peter rode his horse on horseback to a well-fortified Trinity Sergius monastery. Soon there came his amusing regiments and one Streltsy regiment. Some noblemen and some of the boyars came. Sophia's attempt to raise the archers ended in failure. Meanwhile, the number of supporters of Peter increased every day. A month later the power completely passed into Peter's hands. Sophia, all left, was imprisoned in a monastery, and her closest assistant Prince V.V. Golitsyn was exiled to the north. 3. Azovin hiking and Peter journey for the border Azov campaigns. In the first years after the fall of the government of Sophia, Peter did not take an active part in the government of the state. He was still engaged in military games, which, however, began to take an increasingly serious character. On Pereyaslavo Lake, Peter with a small number of assistants built and launched a warship. Soon after, he went to Arkhangelsk, where he first saw how large ships sailed the sea. In Moscow, Peter often visited a German settlement among the foreigners who settled in Russia and found useful people here. The old general, Scotsman Patrick Gordon, an expert on military affairs, borrowed his stories about the battles he was party to. Always cheerful Swiss Franz Lefort arranged all sorts of entertainment. At the same time, Peter continued to work on his education. Dutchman Timmerman gave him lessons in arithmetic, geometry, artillery. In a short time Peter achieved such success that he began to correct the mistakes of his teacher, who was not very knowledgeable in the sciences. Military exercises and maneuvers were the preparation of a new campaign against the Crimea. After the unsuccessful campaigns of Golitsyn, the Moscow government limited itself to defending the southern borders against the attacks of the Tatars. The war started against Austria by Austria and Poland, to which Russia joined, was very sluggish. Austria and Poland entered into negotiations with Turkey on peace, not caring about Russia's interests. Then the Moscow government began negotiations with the Crimean Khan. Russia demanded the fortress of Azov, occupied by the Turkish garrison. The Khan resolutely denied this. Old Russian lands of the Azov Sea were necessary for Russia to leave the Donets Sea. Owning Azov, Russia could threaten the Crimean Khanate. Therefore, Peter decided to seize the Azov force. In the spring of 1695, the 30,000 Russian army descended on the river vessels along the Oka River to the Volga and crossed the Don. Peter wrote to Moscow. They were joking at Kochukov, a place near Moscow where maneuvers were being made, and now we are going to play Azov. Without a navy, Peter could not block the fortress from the sea. The Turks constantly received new reinforcements, weapons and food from the sea. The lack of coherence in the actions of Russian troops and their inability to help each other in combat allowed the Turks to collect their forces in the most dangerous places of the besieged fortress. The coming autumn forced the siege of Azov to be lifted. The unsuccessful campaign against Azov visually showed Peter how Russia needed a navy. Deciding to resume the campaign for the following summer, Peter ordered to build a rowing fleet from galleys and other light vessels, as small vessels could be built in one winter. On the bank of the Voronezh River, not far from its confluence in the Don, shipyards were built. Around grew oak, lime and pine forests, which gave excellent material for shipbuilding. Peter himself took part in the work as an engineer, then as a simple carpenter with an axe in his hands. In the spring of 1696, to the amazement of the Turks, a Russian fleet of 30 galleys and a large number of transport ships and boats appeared near Azov. The Turkish fleet left without a fight. Peter besieged Azov from the sea, and from the land. In July, having lost hope for help from Constantinople, the Turks surrendered. Peter's trip abroad, taking Azov, did not lead to the end of the war. The Turks had a strong fleet and continued to dominate the Black Sea. Therefore, Peter decided to send a great embassy to Western Europe. It was to establish closer ties with the countries of Western Europe. Peter instructed the embassy not only to strengthen and expand the alliance of European states against Turkey, but also to recruit the necessary number of foreign specialists, engineers and artillerymen for the Russian army. The embassy left Moscow in 1697. Peter himself was in his staff. hiding under the name of the Sergeant Peter Mikhailov. Peter wanted to become more familiar with European life, with its culture and technology. On his letters to Moscow, he put a seal with the following words: "I'm in the position of a student and I'm looking for my teachers in Slavonic. I'm asking for the tutoring and teaching of students in the Dutch city of Sardam, famous for its good shipyard." Peter settled in a small house of a blacksmith and entered the shipyard as a simple carpenter. However, Peter quickly learned, as many Dutch merchants visited Russia and well remembered the king's signs, his high growth, about 2 meters, and gigantic strength. From that time, Peter could not hide from the intrusive crowd of curious. The uprising in Astrakhan. The first major uprising occurred in Astrakhan. Every year at the beginning of navigation in Astrakhan, a large number of newcomers, hired to work in salt and fish industries, gathered. Heavy taxes have especially affected the situation of the poor. On the night of July 30, 1705, an uprising of the Streltsy and the lower strata of the urban population of Astrakhan began. Voivodes and most of the initial people were killed, but the authorities in the city were rushed to capture more prosperous trading people, among whom the Council of Foremen was elected. The rebels, with the participation of local garrisons and residents, managed to seize several cities along the rivers Yaiku, Ural, Terek and Volga. Attempts were made to raise the Don Cossacks, but they ended in failure. The well-to-do Cossacks arrested in Cherkassk Astrakhan delegates who arrived there. Against the insurgent Astrakhan troops were sent under the command of Field Marshal Sheremetev. Among the rebels began discord. Prosperous trading people, along with the Metropolitan, sent a delegation to the Tsar to ask for pardon, and the impoverished population gathered in a circle meeting, which decided not to surrender the city. In March 1706 Astrakhan was taken after the artillery fire. Thus, the Astrakhan uprising lasted almost 8 months. The uprising in 1707, 1708 years. The Astrakhan uprising barely ended, as a more formidable uprising began on the Don led by Ataman Kondraty-Bulavin. After the capture of Azov, the Don Cossacks were brought to the service and to various jobs and duties. The government began to increasingly restrict the Cossack self-government, as an independent Cossack army was dangerous for him. Since the end of the X7th century, a huge number of fugitive peasants from the southern districts were sent to the upper reaches of the Don. Splitters left the same regions, escaping from church persecution. The landowners of the southern districts constantly complained to the government that the peasants were leaving them. The government sent several punitive detachments to Don several times. They fished runaway peasants and ruined the Cossack towns in which lived runaway. At the beginning of the X8th century, on the Don, with exceptional cruelty, the punitive detachment under the command of Prince Yuri Dolgoruki acted. In one of the autumn nights of 1707, when a detachment of Dolgoruki settled down for the night in a stanitsa on the Ida River, the goblet led by the Ataman Kondraty-Bulavin interrupted the entire Tsarist detachment. The uprising quickly spread among the upland Cossacks. The excitement also spread to the working people of Voronezh shipyards. In the Tambov and Kozlovsky districts, serf peasants smashed the landowners and went to the Cossacks. The uprising was not only Cossack, but also peasant. Bulavin, after one unsuccessful battle, went to Zaporozhye, where he thought to raise the Ukrainian Cossacks. But there he met opposition from the well-to-do Cossacks. Yet, despite the prohibition of the hetman, the Zaporozhye, Gulyadia, poor rank-and-file Cossacks by certain groups made their way to the Don and took part in the uprising. In the spring of 1708, Bulavin returned to the upper reaches of the Don. The spontaneous uprising swept through this time a large area. Hastily assembling detachments of the rebels, Bulavin went with them to the administrative center of the Don Cossack army, Kilograms. Cherkassk. The grassroots well-to-do Cossacks were also dissatisfied with the actions of the Tsarist government, but they were afraid of the Golts. When the army at Ataman tried to stop the movement of the insurgents, Most of the Cossacks of his detachment took sides with outside to the side of Bulovin. Ordinary Cossacks conspired to shoot Bulovin's Cossacks not with bullets, but with dust blank charges. The people of the villages met him with bread and salt. Not meeting a strong resistance, Bulovin easily mastered Cherkasy. The well-to-do Cossacks, recognizing Bulovin as the ataman, did not cease to act in secret against him. Bulovin did not show the necessary resolve. He hesitated in Cherkask, while the Tsarist government took hasty measures to suppress the uprising. In the hands of the government was Azov, located in the neighborhood of Cherkasy. Bulovin missed the time for the sudden capture of Azov, and when, after 2 months in Cherkask, he tried to take Azov, he failed. This failure was used by wealthy Cossacks. They made a coup in Cherkasy. The house where Bulovin lived was surrounded. Bulovin long shot and, not wanting to get into the hands of enemies, shot himself. After the death of Bulovin, in many places in the lower Volga and in the upper reaches of the Don and Donets, detachments under the command of the atamans of Koklak, Darnoy, Goloy, and others continue to operate. The proclamations of Bulovin and his atamans secretly spread among the people. We do not care about the mob, that is, we do not want to fight against the mob, it's up to the boyars who do wrong, wrote the ataman naked. In response to these calls, a new mass of rebels rose. On the Volga, the Bulovins took Tsaritsyn, now Stalingrad, and approached Saratov. The Tsarist government was very much afraid that the Bulovin detachments would infiltrate the Middle Volga, where the Bashkir uprising was at that time. Separate outbreaks of peasant unrest occurred in different parts of the country, near Smolensk, near Nizhny Novgorod, in the Upper Volga region, in Karelia, in the Northern Territory and elsewhere. The government sent a large punitive army to the Don and the Lower Volga region under the command of Prince Vasily Dolgorukhy. The scattered detachments of the insurgents could not resist the regular Tsarist troops for a long time. Prince Dolgorukhy almost completely exterminated in the area of the uprising of the adult male population. At the end of 1708, the main areas of the uprising were occupied by the Tsarist troops. Rise of the Bashkirs. As early as 1704, 3 years before the uprising on the Don, disturbances began among the Bashkirs. The main reason for the uprising was the seizure of Bashkir lands by Russian landlords and new heavy taxes. According to the Bashkirs, they were taxed even for black and gray eyes. The Bashkirs refused to pay taxes and did not let the profit-making people go to their lands to conduct a census. The following year, some unrest broke out into open rebellions of the Bashkir population, who then moved to the right bank of the Kama and raised the Tatars, Sherimis, Marie, Vodyaks, Udmurts and Chuvashes. Leadership of the uprising was captured in their hands by rich baiters, feudal nobility, among whom stood Alder and Kusyum. They aspired to the formation of a special Bashkir state, which is in vassal dependence on the Crimea or Turkey. In the spring of 1708, the Bashkirs suffered a severe defeat from the Tsarist troops. After that many of the baiters, including Kusyum, withdrew from the insurrection. The disparate actions of the insurgent Bashkirs continued for several more years. 6. End of the warrior with Sweden. The War of Peter I in the East. Charles XII's march to Russia. Only in 1706 Charles XII managed to defeat Augustus II and force him to make peace. The Swedes remained the only enemy, Russia. At the end of 1707 the Swedish troops moved to the Russian borders. In the summer of next year Charles XII approached the Dnieper from Mogilev. Peter expected that Charles XII would go to Moscow. But the Swedish king, convinced that the Russian troops are not like those who fought with him at Narva, did not dare to go deep into the country. From Mogilev, he turned to the south, to Ukraine. There, Charles XII thought of resting the army, replenishing food supplies and waiting for new reinforcements from Sweden. In addition, Ukraine's hetman Ivan Mazepa was in secret correspondence with Charles XII and prepared treason. He assured Karl that it was only for the Swedish troops to appear in Ukraine, how the uprising against Peter would rise in it. These expectations of May's-Pa were not justified. When the hetman changed Russia and crossed over to the side of Charles XII with a small detachment of the Cossack sergeant, the Ukrainian population, who treated the Swedes as foreign invaders, did not support the hetman traitor. In autumn 1708, Peter destroyed on the Saj River, near the village of Lesnoy, on the left bank of the Dnieper, the Swedish corps of Levenhaupt, headed for Charles XII with a large train of ammunition. This further worsened the situation of the Swedes. They were threatened with hunger, as they could not get food from the population hostile to them. In many places, partisan detachments, supported by units of regular troops, operated. In April 1709, Charles XII approached the small fortress of Poltava and began its siege. In the event of the capture of this fortress, Swedes opened unprotected roads to Moscow and Voronezh, in which food supplies were collected for the Russian army. Peter also feared that the Turks would violate the peace conditions and help the Swedes from Azov. Victory near Poltava. Peter with the main forces of the army hastened to the rescue of Poltava. In its environs, on the bank of the Vorskla River, on June 27, 1709, a decisive battle took place between Russian and Swedish troops. Before the battle began, Peter turned to his troops with the order, "Warriors, here comes the hour that will decide the fate of the fatherland. So, you should not think that you are fighting for Peter, but for the state Peter was given, for his kind, for the fatherland. Nor should you be embarrassed by the glory of the enemy, as if unconquerable, to which you have repeatedly proved your lies by your victories over him. And about Petra know that his life is inexpensive, if only Russia lived in bliss and glory for your well-being." The Swedes started the battle with a swift attack on the disposition of the Russians. Between the rows of Swedes were warned on a stretcher of a wounded Karl, trying to inspire his soldiers. However, all the efforts of the Swedes to break the resistance of the Russian regiments were in vain. 2 hours went hand-to-hand fighting. Peter led the fight and appeared in the most dangerous places. His hat and saddle were shot through bullets. The onslaught of the Russians was so strong that the Swedes could not stand it and ran. Only a small detachment of the Swedish cavalry, led by Karl and May's-Pa, left the persecution and disappeared behind the Turkish border. The rest of the Swedish troops surrendered. In total, about 20,000 people were taken prisoner, including all the generals of Charles XII. The brilliant victory of the Russian troops near Poltava was of great importance. In Europe, the Swedish troops were considered the best, and Karl was the unconquerable commander. Now Sweden's military power on land was destroyed. Therefore, Poland and Denmark once again entered into an alliance with Russia to continue the struggle with Sweden. Prussia joined this alliance. War with Turkey. Charles XII, who fled after the defeat to Turkey, tried to raise it against Russia. In 1710, Turkey declared war on Russia. Peter immediately moved with the 40,000-strong army to the Danube. He counted on the assistance of the Polish troops and on the uprising of the Slavs conquered by Turkey. However, a large Turkish army, about 200,000 people, bound for Russian borders, surrounded in 1711 on the Prut River, near the Falsi Tract, a Russian army led by Peter. Russian troops, not the Battle of Poltava. A mosaic picture of M.V. Lomonosov's work. Having neither food, nor a sufficient quantity of ammunition, rendered fierce resistance to the Turks. The Turkish commander-in-chief did not know about the plight of the Russian army and therefore agreed to conclude peace. According to the peace conditions, Peter returned the Azov to Turkey. End of the Swedish War. Having finished the Turkish War, Peter again turned to the war against Sweden. Within the next few years after the Battle of Poltava, Russian troops completed a liberation from the Swedes of the coast of the Riga and the Finnish Gulfs. In Pomerania, on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, the Russians acted against the Swedes together with the Prussians and Danes. The main efforts of Peter were directed to firmly anchoring Russia's seacoast. In 1714, a young Russian fleet commanded by Peter won a brilliant victory over the Swedish fleet at Cape Ganguda, Finland. Peter planted the infantry on small ore ships that came close to the Swedish ships, despite the brutal gunfire from their sides. Russian infantrymen climbed the stairs to the decks of enemy ships and, after a bitter bayonet battle, seized them. Failure at sea compelled Charles XII to agree to peace negotiations with Russia. They were interrupted by the death of Charles. The Swedish government decided to make peace with Prussia, Denmark and Poland and concentrate all its forces against Russia. A new major victory over the Swedish fleet was gained by the Russians in 1720 near the island of Grangum. Russia, cut off from the Baltic and Black Seas during the XIII centuries, once again became a mighty sea power. Russian troops, thanks to the domination of the Russian fleet by the Baltic Sea, landed on the Swedish coast and appeared even in the vicinity of Stockholm. Finally, in 1721, in Nystad, Finland, peace was concluded. Russia received the coast of the Finnish and Riga Bays, part of Karelia, with Vyborg, Ingria, Åland, with Narva and Revel, and Livonia, with Riga. The victory over Sweden was of great importance for Russia. The lack of convenient exits to the sea delayed the economic development of the country. First Livonia, and then Sweden deliberately closed for Russia the possibility of not only trade, but also cultural relations with Western Europe. Peter struck the road to the Baltic Sea and, thus, completed the struggle of the Russian people for the seaside, which began as early as the end of the XV century. Peter captured only what was absolutely necessary for the normal development of the country. After the conclusion of the Nystad peace, the Senate, the highest state institution, presented Peter with the title of Emperor, and Russia was officially called the Russian Empire. This new name testified to the growth of the power and strength of the Russian state. Relations with the East. Despite the long war with Sweden, which demanded big expenses and big worries, Peter did not lose sight of the eastern border of Russia. In southwestern Siberia, the Russians in 1720 years, took possession of the entire upper course of the Irtysh, on the banks of which a significant number of small fortresses were built, including Omsk and Semipalatinsk. From the upper reaches of the Irtysh was an old caravan road to Turkestan. Simultaneously, the Russian government was preparing an offensive into Central Asia from the side of the Caspian Sea. In 1716, Prince Bukovich-Cherkassky was sent to Kiev with a detachment, who, under the pretense of congratulating the Khan on his accession to the throne, was to collect economic and military-political information about Khiva and Bukhara. The detachment of Bukovich was almost completely interrupted. This failure temporarily stopped the advance of the Russians for the Caspian Sea. Peter also sought to consolidate on the western shore of the Caspian Sea. This was of great importance for strengthening Russian influence in Transcaucasia and Iran, trade with which at the beginning of the X8th century quickly developed. The pretext for Russia sending a military expedition to the western shore of the Caspian Sea was the pogrom of Russian merchants during the Shamaki uprising in Azerbaijan against Iranian domination, provoked by Turkey. Peter himself participated in the campaign, which began in 1722, shortly after the conclusion of peace with Sweden. Russia and Transcaucasia found support among feudal lords of Azerbaijan, Eastern Georgia and Armenia, local merchants and the Christian Church. Their benevolent attitude toward the Russian troops is due to fear of Turkey, which sought to seize the entire Caucasus. Under a peace treaty with Iran in 1723, Russia received the western shore of the Caspian Sea along with Derbent and Baku and the southern coast with Astrabad. However, Russia could not keep these lands and soon after the death of Peter returned them to Iran.